Chapter 29. "Do you believe in destiny?" asked Lucas. The question came suddenly, and it surprised Carson Price, to whom it had been directed. Lucas Flynn had not spoken to him at all on the drive up north. The demon prophet certainly did not blame him. After all, thousands of people, many of them innocent, had been killed at his direction. Although he had not felt guilt for many years, he understood that a divine key-bearer held firm to ideals that included the idea that murder was unethical. Though Carson had a black key that allowed him to see the future, he knew that his visions were becoming less frequent, and that since Angelica's men had captured divine key-bearers for her tournament, things had become far less predictable. "I used to," admitted Carson. "I used to think that I was meant to be far more than I have become. You know, I was caught up in the feelings of superiority that came with having a black key." "You don't anymore?" asked Lucas. "No, of course not," said Carson with a laugh. He said it as though the answer to the question were obvious. Can you imagine a single unavoidable path that all life must follow? "So you see possibilities when you use your key?" asked Lucas. He felt uncomfortable asking about using a demon key, but he was determined to have an answer. "Yes," said Carson with a laugh. "I mean, don't get me wrong, some things are clearer than others. The arrival of you and your friends, for example." "We were meant to come here?" asked Lucas. "I obviously can't say that there was any intention involved," replied Carson. "I can't say that you were meant to come here, only that I saw it clearly, and that I was not the only one to see it." "The demon prophetess?" asked Lucas. Carson nodded. "Now don't get me wrong. I prefer my women young, with smooth skin, and—" started Carson with a laugh. He turned to face Lucas as he was about to continue, and realized he was speaking to a child. He frowned and cleared his throat as he turned back to the road. "I'm just saying I've never known anyone like Sarah Hawkins." "You've been working for her this entire time," exclaimed Lucas. "You're a bright kid," observed Carson with a laugh. "And I suppose now that the syndicate has dissolved, there's no harm in admitting you're right. Well, I admire Angelica for many reasons. I swore an oath to serve the demon prophetess long before I met her." "A demon worshipper that honors his promises," whispered Lucas in disbelief. "It shouldn't be that surprising," said Carson with a loud laugh. "As much distrust as there may be, the demon lords trusted Sarah Hawkins, and she trusted them with their keys." "Why didn't she just keep all the keys?" asked Lucas, who was still confused about the sense of trust among some demon worshippers. "They say that the original demon keys cannot be wielded by just anyone," said Carson. "In that sense, they are similar to your divine keys. The key accepts or chooses its bearer." "But you still doubt that Sarah Hawkins was destined to have it?" asked Lucas. Carson laughed. "Being chosen for something is not the same thing as being destined to have something," said Carson. "A tremendous amount of effort and planning has gone into everything that has happened. For example, my master wants you and your friends to survive, but if it hadn't been for impressive efforts by myself and others, several of you could have died. I had visions showing both ways. I had to help you so that you didn't freeze to death back down south." "That brings up something else," said Lucas in a low voice as he narrowed his eyes. "I get Angelica Sterling," said Carson with a smile. He licked his lips as he drove the vehicle. The thought of Carson Price involved in some sort of romantic relationship with anyone made Lucas feel disgusted. Certainly he was not ignorant of Carson's desires, and he was not motivated to protect Angelica Sterling, but hearing it out loud made Lucas's stomach turn. Even with the grotesque images that Carson's statement had conjured, Lucas had to admit to himself that this explanation for the demon prophet's assistance was most likely accurate. "And what does Sarah Hawkins get?" asked Lucas. Carson burst out laughing. "That's over my head," said Carson. I have no idea. The only thing I do know is that she was interested in your efforts against the Destroyer." The memory of the Destroyer made Lucas lower his head in thought. They had set out so sure that they were destined to stop the Destroyer and save the world, but in spite of their efforts, perhaps even because of their efforts, Abaddon still appeared, and the world was thrown into a state of ice and fire. Their goals had gone from save the world to rescue fill-in-the-blank, who was captured by demon worshippers, and it had felt tedious and demoralizing. After being a part of something that felt epic, strong, and important, he had personally felt weak, small, and unimportant. It was so ironic to him that talking to a demon worshipper had been a source of encouragement. He was forced to confess that he now felt more confident. After all, if a greedy, murderous demon worshipper could have confidence to keep working to get something as self-indulgent as a relationship with Angelica Sterling, why should a person dedicated to morality and justice give up on the idea that the world could and should be saved? Lucas put his hands up to the heater vent near the passenger window. Even though Carson had given him chemical hand warmers to fight the effects of frostbite in his fingers and toes, the hours of travel had made them lose their effectiveness, and the warm air was soothing to his cold fingers. He smiled and closed his eyes as the hum of the engine lulled him into a comforting rest. As sleep drew near, the sound of the motor grew quieter until it could not be heard at all. The sensation of the seatbelt on his lap seemed to fade away. He opened his eyes and saw a room filled with beds. There were dozens of people with tubes connecting them. The blue tint that surrounded everything informed him that he was having a vision. As Lucas walked around, he noticed that all of the individuals on beds seemed to be elderly. There were monitors with lights attached to each of the beds, and they seemed to indicate that the patients were alive. The similarity to the patients of the sleeping sickness that they had seen in the mountains sent a shiver down Lucas's spine. The room had lights installed, but most of them were off, making things difficult to see clearly. There were no windows on the walls, except for 2 round windows on a pair of swinging double doors. Light from the hallway shone through them, making it appear that there were a pair of spotlights shining on 2 of the patients in the middle of the room. Had it not been for the blue ambience, it would have been even more difficult for Lucas to make his way around. The floor appeared to be polished hardwood, and even in the darkness, Lucas could see black marks from the soles of shoes that had been made in various places. Against the wall there were a few small carts that held gauze, scissors, tape, and other items that Lucas could not immediately identify. They also had drawers on the sides in various shapes that undoubtedly held additional tools. Over in the corner, Lucas took note of about 5 wheelchairs that had been collapsed for temporary storage. As he walked between the beds, he tried to make sense of the tangled wires and tubes that were attached to the patients. He wondered if perhaps he was reading too much into the existence of patients on beds in a facility that appeared to be a hospital or a care center. Eventually, though, he found clear tubes that seemed to be coming from each of the patients and merging into a single tube. No sooner had Lucas noticed the tubes than the pair of double doors swung open and 2 people walked in. One of them was a man with straight brown hair and bright green eyes. Lucas guessed he was just under 6 feet tall, but very muscular. He wore dark pants and a green button-up shirt with a long white lab coat over the top. He had a serious look on his face. The woman who accompanied him had long blonde hair, which reminded him of Jennifer. She was a bit shorter, though, and was wearing something that Lucas doubted Jennifer would ever consider. She had a very tight red top with a low neck and a tight black skirt, and she had a small lab coat over the top with the sleeves rolled halfway up her forearms. She also had a set of black, high-heeled shoes. "David, you have no idea what is going to happen," said the woman in a concerned tone. "You sound like my father, Corey," said the man. Corey grabbed David's arm. "Listen," she said. "Your father may be a stuffy, unsympathetic, disagreeable man, but he is the Heaven's Breath key-bearer." Lucas recognized that this was David Young, who Jacob Wilson had suggested would work well in his senior care facility. He did not recognize the woman, but assumed that she was the Corey to which Senator Wilson had referred when suggesting a person to recruit David. "Corey, I'm not afraid," said David as he took her hands. "This entire backwards country is stuck in the past. Everyone wants to ask why, but we should be more willing to ask why not." Corey pulled a lock of blonde hair behind her ear as she looked into David's eyes. After a moment, she closed her eyes and pressed her lips against his. "Great, just what I wanted to see," muttered Lucas with a frown as he waited for them to finish. "Be careful," whispered Corey as she wiped a tear from her eye. Lucas rolled his eyes as they held each other closely. "Please be careful," said Lucas in a mocking tone. "If anything were to happen to your massive biceps, I would have to break up with you and find someone else who will purchase my shoes and lift heavy objects for me." "It's okay, babe," continued Lucas in a tone mocking David Young. "I'm awesome because I ask why not, like murdering these innocent people. Why not? Harness the power of an archdemon. Why not? Shave my eyebrows and switch to a liquid diet. Why not?" "You're so deep," continued Lucas in a falsetto voice mocking Corey. "I feel so lucky to have a really strong and easily manipulated guy with me." Corey turned in Lucas's direction. For a split second, Lucas thought perhaps they had heard him, but he quickly realized that she was looking at a cart of medical tools against the wall behind him. Lucas let out a nervous laugh to mask his relief, even though no one could hear him. "All right," said David in a serious tone as he picked up the end of the tube. "Here it goes." David jammed the end of the tube into his gut. Wires around the tube began to blink as the bodies on the bed began to tremble. Lucas frowned in disgust. Energy flowed out of the comatose victims into David, and a dark purple light began to swirl about him. "David!" exclaimed Corey. As he cried out in pain, his voice became less human. His hair burned off of his head, and small black horns began to erupt from his scalp. After a moment, the monitors on the bed simultaneously began beeping. Lucas guessed that meant he had finished extracting the life from his victims. Corey began shutting the monitors off to stop the obnoxious beeping. She did not dare come too close to David, who still had dark energy swirling about his body. After a few minutes, she had shut off the monitors on all the dead patients. "Corey," whispered David. Corey cautiously approached him as he stood up. Lucas realized that because there were fewer than 100 patients, the transformation was incomplete. He still seemed mostly human except for his baldness and the stubs of 2 small horns near his forehead. "David?" she whispered in fear. "Don't be afraid," he said in his echoing voice. She cautiously put out her hand and touched his face. "You're okay?" asked Corey. "Better than okay," said David with a smile. "Project Abaddon is a success." Corey ran her hands along David's large arms and finally held him closely. "What are you going to do about Senator Wilson?" asked Corey in a worried tone. "I'm going to end him," said David with a soft laugh. Lucas sat up and opened his eyes. He found that his vision had ended and that he was seated next to Carson Price. "Oh good, you're awake," said Carson with a smile. "I nearly dozed off while you were resting, and we almost drove off the road and died." He laughed loudly. Lucas turned to him and gave him a disapproving look. "How far are we?" asked Lucas. "Only a couple miles," said Carson. "You don't have to worry about driving." "Or do I?" asked Lucas as he pointed to an armadillo corpse in the road. Carson swerved around it and laughed loudly. "Maybe," he said. Lucas frowned until they turned a corner and saw the sun on the horizon in the northeast. Though it was too early in the morning to get a definitive sense of the warmth it provided, the impact of seeing the blinding natural light shine between the hills on the horizon filled Lucas with a soothing, warm sensation. Part of him wanted to close his eyes as though he had wrapped himself in a warm blanket, but a more powerful compulsion forced him to keep his eyes open. There had been many days when he had wondered whether he would again see the light of the sun. Being raised in the temperate zone, he loved the cycles that day and night brought. Of course, he was no fool. He knew that the same cycle of light and darkness also beckoned to dangerous enemies. He knew better than to think they could simply locate Jennifer and Stephanie and escort them out. He turned and looked back in the bed of the truck. With the low light of dawn growing brighter with sunlight, he could more easily see the weapons and ammunition that Carson Price had acquired in preparation for their assault. The drive did not last much longer before they came to an empty parking lot. Carson turned the car off. "This is it?" exclaimed Lucas. "Well, the entrance is nearby," said Carson with a laugh. "Where did you think we were going?" "A building of some sort," replied Lucas. "Oh, you don't realize this. During Civil War II, the Federalist states created large anti-nuclear bunkers," said Carson. "Anti-nuclear?" asked Lucas. "You've never heard of nuclear weapons?" asked Carson with a laugh. "No," said Lucas. "Well, that takes us back even further then," said Carson. "People developed weapons that harnessed the energy from fusion reactions, or more commonly, fission reactions." "Really?" asked Lucas. "Yes," answered Carson. "Anyway, they produced huge explosions. One or two could completely level a city." "I bet," said Lucas. Carson was a bit surprised at his enthusiasm regarding weapons capable of mass destruction. So back in the last days of the United States, they decided in a desperate move against the Federalist states to use one on Dallas, said Carson. "I take it that was the capital of the Federalist states?" asked Lucas. "Yeah. So anyway," said Carson, "the Federalists launched a counter-nuclear attack that hit all the big United States cities: Chicago, New York, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, San Francisco. You do realize those names mean nothing to me, right?" asked Lucas. Carson laughed. "That's right," said Carson. "Anyway, the nuclear war turned into a huge opportunity in Asia, Europe, and Africa. That's when the Demon Lords secretly began building huge armies, preparing to return to power. It worked out well in a lot of places, but William Fine underestimated the resolve of the Federalist states." "What did they do?" asked Lucas. "They fought," said Carson. "They fought hard. They also built strong bunkers in case the United States came at them with more nuclear weapons. One of them is right here in El Paso." "So it's underground?" asked Lucas. "Right," said Carson. "How are we going to break into a bomb-proof bunker?" asked Lucas. "You forget that I did this before," said Carson with a laugh. "Oh, right. The credits you stole," said Lucas. "So what's the plan?" "So here's the secret," said Carson. "We just open the door and go in." He pointed to a shack at the edge of the parking lot. Lucas looked at it and then back at Carson as he pulled his black key out. "I just need to find out where the guards are, and then we sneak past him," he added as he held up his black key. Lucas nodded. The plan was not unnecessarily complicated, and he decided that while Carson was not entirely trustworthy, he had been telling him the truth with respect to his motivations. Lucas went back to the truck and picked up a number of guns and filled his pockets with ammunition. "Okay," said Lucas. "Let's go." The two of them walked toward the shack. Lucas opened the door and found a hatch inside. He and Carson rotated the round hand wheel to slowly gain access. These things were also intended to be airtight in case of poison gases or other biological weapons, said Carson as they twisted the hand wheel. Eventually they opened the door. Once inside, they quickly closed the hatch door and rotated the hand wheel to seal it back. "We don't want them to know anyone has gained access," whispered Lucas as they tightened it up. At Carson's direction, the two of them began sneaking down the corridors. The walls were lined with tubes and cables for light, electricity, air, and water. The floor was composed of a series of metal grates that provided grip. The ceiling was arched and had small electric lights every 30 feet. Except for the stainless steel floor grates, Everything was painted white. They approached an intersection between corridors, and Carson grabbed Lucas's shoulder to stop him. Lucas turned and gave him an inquiring look. "Against the wall," he whispered. The two of them pressed their backs against the wall of the corridor. After a moment of silence, two men ran past. Lucas raised his eyebrows in surprise, because each of them had pairs of curved blades sticking out of their right forearms. They appeared to have been surgically attached to their arms, and the length of the blades extended a few inches further than their fingertips, and were only sharp on the edge facing away from the arms. "That's new," said Carson in surprise as they vanished from view. "Augments," muttered Lucas. "Oh, like your row 87 or 84 or whatever?" asked Carson. "Row 82. And yes," said Lucas. "I guess Miranda's moving forward with her project," said Carson. The two of them began moving down the corridor again. "What project?" whispered Lucas. "Without actual demon lords, our black keys don't last as long or work as well," said Carson. "Angelica's solution was the tournament, but of course with the diminishing number of participants and the fact that your friends ruined it, that idea became less popular." "So the Death Witch is moving to augmentation?" asked Lucas. "Exactly," replied Carson. "They were impressed by Row 82, and they discovered that Timothy Young had a number of projects that were meant to help the infirmed. Miranda wanted to begin immediately, but Angelica did not." "They fought," guessed Lucas. "And Angelica was captured," said Carson. "She's being held with your friends." "Why didn't she kill Angelica?" asked Lucas. "They're using beautiful women to entertain and manipulate men," said Carson. "They will probably also use them to breed children for experimentation." The casual tone with which Carson spoke angered Lucas, but he decided it was best not to express his distaste. "From where will the next patrol be coming?" asked Lucas as they approached an intersection. "I don't know yet," said Carson in the same casual tone as he pulled out his black key. "There's a patrol that will be coming down the left corridor ahead," he said. Lucas nodded as they proceeded to the right. The hallway curved around as they proceeded, which normally would have made Lucas a bit nervous. While they would not be immediately noticed by a patrol in the same hallway, they would also be blinded to unexpected enemies in their path. Of course, with Carson Price's demon key, he felt confident that they would have an advantage. Perhaps that was why he was so shocked to see Miranda Drake with her dark green cloak appear before them with a dozen augment minions.